CityCast from Explocity.
When in silks you came and dazzled me with the beauty of your spring, you brought a flower to bloom, love within my being. Lived with me, breath of my breath, being in my being, nor left my side. But now the wheel of time has turned and you are gone. No joys abide. You pressed your lips upon my lips, your heart upon my beating heart. And I have no wish to fall in love again. For they who sold love's remedy have shut shop, and I seek in vain. My life now gives no ray of light. I bring no solace to heart or eye. Out of dust to dust again, of no use to anyone am I. Delhi was once a paradise where love held sway and reigned, but its charms lie ravished now, and only ruins remain. No tears were shed when shroudless they were laid in common graves. No prayers were read for the noble dead, unmarked remain their graves. The heart distressed, the wounded flesh, the mind ablaze, the rising sigh, the drop of blood, the broken heart, tears on the lashes of the eye. But things cannot remain, O Zafar, thus, for who can tell? Through God's great mercy and the Prophet, all may yet be well.
I will admit that until I had read William Dalrymple, I knew little of the history of Delhi, which is inextricable from the history of India. Although I lived in Delhi for 8 years, all I ever knew about the history of India, my country, was what was taught to me by middle school history teachers. They merely regurgitated dry passages from textbooks. There was no romance in the way we were taught history. So when I lived in Delhi, right in the heart of visible history with crumbling monuments and all, I couldn't get past those apathetic and uncurious history textbooks. And then I left Delhi to move to Bangalore. And then William Dalrymple happened. In the decades that he unravelled Delhi for me, it morphed from a city that I only knew as too expensive for my modest salary to a city that hell had Djinns in it, Djinns with a D. The more I listened to William Dalrymple as I interviewed him today, the more I appreciated his sentient feel for history, a feeling that makes humans out of historical personalities. For this reason, probably, when I first read City of Djinns, I will confess to an inexplicable sense of envy, as if I should and could have written that book. A sort of, oh, I wish I had said that feeling. But I had no such flights of fancy reading everything else he has written, most recently Anarchy, an account of the East India Company, and what happens when there is no separation between merch and state. Dalrymple's prose is compelling and direct, and that makes his books that much more engaging. Let's find out what else makes him one of the most respected writers of the history of India and the entire region of its historical influence. So, William Dalrymple, it is my privilege to welcome you to the Literary City.
Very kind of you to have me. Thank you very much.
Researching you for this podcast meant going down one delightful rabbit hole after another, but one question remained unanswered. William, what makes you laugh?
Quite a lot of things, not necessarily appropriate ones. I think I grew up with a family where laughter was very much part of everyday life and a release for pressure valves, and I laugh a lot.
Just a little unsettling to hear a historian say that. But I guess there is a sense of humor to the fog of war.
No, exactly. No, I think my early books, the travel books, particularly the first two in Xanadu and City of Djinns, I think were basically comic books, and are written at least partly for laughs. Things darken a bit as middle age sets in, and we start dealing with sort of genocide of Christians in the Middle East and 1857 and colonial uprisings and the loot of India. But
right, life happens, and that other thing.
I'm not in any sense saying that's a reflection of some sort of dark trajectory in my life. Far from it. I've been very lucky and had a lovely time.
The foibles of men, always funny. Now, the poems that you read at the beginning of this podcast, they were from The Last Mughal, correct? Bahadur Shah Zafar. How did you come upon them?
Sure. I came back with that text, that translation from a trip to Karachi long ago when I went to track down the great novelist of Delhi, Ahmed Ali, the author of Twilight in Delhi, which had just been republished. I loved it. It was a wonderful, wonderful book about... Then I discovered that Ahmed Ali miraculously was actually still alive. And when I went and found him, he'd spent quite a lot of his 70s and 80s translating beautifully the poetry of Ghalib and Zafar and Zawq, the great Urdu poets, into English. And this was one he'd given me, which was, it takes several of the last couplets of Zafar, some of which are apocryphal and some scholars believe may not actually been written by Zafar because they're not in his divan. But he'd put them together into a sort of lament for Delhi in a sort of Tennysonian style. And so these couplets had become rather like a sort of Victorian lament. And I loved it. I thought it was a beautiful, beautiful versioning of Zafar's Persian couplets and Urdu couplets. And I put it as a sort of epigram for Last Mughal. And it sits there. That stands to me as a beautiful translation or version of Zafar's work.
The good thing is that these things don't always have to be subject to provenance, do they?
Exactly. It's a work of art in itself, that poem. And I've read it all over the world. Never fails to move audiences.
You started as a travel writer. You were just about 22 when you wrote In Xanadu.
Yes, it's 22 when I was published. I wrote it when I was 21, when I was still at college and just finishing college.
How, as a college student, did you make the trip from Italy to Chengdu in Mongolia?
I was very lucky. I went to this college at Cambridge, Trinity. So there were scholarships. And I noticed there was a particular scholarship available on the notice board for medieval historians. And I knew there were only a handful of us in the college. So that we had a pretty good chance of getting something. So I went into the library and got out a Times Atlas of World History and thought, what's the longest medieval journey I could possibly do? Let's apply for the largest possible sum of money. And I found Marco Polo's journey. It was literally that sort of spontaneous and unplanned. And I put in an application. And then just at the very end of term, an envelope was put under my door saying, you won £750. And I went off and did this trip following Marco Polo.
£750 got me
from Cambridge to Beijing and back. Even then, when obviously £700 was worth much more, I don't think we worked out we wouldn't pay for more than at least half the trips staying in hotels. So a lot of time was spent sleeping out. I had a sleeping bag and a foam mat, and ended up bedding down in sort of caravanserais or mosques or just in woods on the outskirts of towns. And but when you're 21, these things don't frighten you.
I imagine Marco Polo and his men had to do similar things.
Well, exactly, and it was a wonder. I've done many trips in my life, and some long and exciting ones, but nothing has ever quite matched that trip for the sheer wonder of sort of starting off in Jerusalem and ending up in Xanadu, literally in Mongolia.
I read that you said Bruce Chatwin was an influence on you.
He was an influence, but in a sense, quite a dangerous influence, in that his prose style was so attractive and infectious, but also uncopyable. He had this incredibly terse style. And I remember when I first produced a first chapter for In Xanadu, I'd been reading too much Chatwin, and I sent it to my editor. And he brought me up when I was still at Cambridge. I got a spectacular advance that had made it into the papers because it was so large at the time. And I sent him this sort of, I thought, beautifully worked, sort of terse, Chatwin-esque passages. And I got a message on the answering machine. And he said, Willie, I hope these are notes, because if they're not, we're going to have to talk about paying that advance back.
Ouch. I had read In Xanadu just after I had read In Patagonia. And I figured that any book that had in the title couldn't be half bad. I wasn't disappointed.
Well, In Xanadu is a very, very much a youthful folly. I'm embarrassed about it now. But at the time, obviously, it was a big success. It kicked my career off and was a bestseller in many languages. And I think it was very much that time, the mid-'80s. Travel writing was very popular.
Oh, yes. It certainly was.
Everyone seemed to be jumping on a train and having a bestseller. And I just caught the end of that before it collapsed.
Speaking of any comparisons with Bruce Chatwin, Mike Derda of the Washington Post once wrote that you were as good as Chatwin. Indeed, as a lay reader, I couldn't tell the difference. I thought both books were fantastic.
Oh, you're very kind. He's a great idol of mine still. And I mean, I think he's someone who's faded very much from view. He was a writer who was extremely fashionable in the 80s and 90s.
Right.
And then he died of AIDS.
Did you get to meet him?
I knew him well, and he was a great help. And I mean, I didn't know him well, but as a young writer, he was very kind to me.
So when you left Cambridge, you didn't leave a note that said, "Gone to Shangdu," did you?
No, I didn't. I just set off. I didn't have anyone to leave a note for, other than my mum, I suppose.
It would seem that moving from travel writing to history for you was a natural progression. Is there a significant overlap between the two?
There is an overlap, and I went from writing travel books, which were full of history, to history books, which I suppose are full of a sense of place. When I write my history, I very much feel I have to go to the places that I'm writing about, and in order to give color and context and geographical weight to where I'm going. And often, you know, you can spend months in the library reading about something, but 5 minutes in the place completely changes your view about it. To give an example from the Anarchy, the great battles against between the East India Company and the Marathas, particularly the battles like Agaum, and when the Duke of Wellington was taking on the troops of Scindia. I'd read that it was near Ajanta, and Ajanta I knew very well because, like anyone else, I'd been around the caves. So I had this image of the battle taking place in a narrow valley like Ajanta, and the sort of troops sort of shooting at each other across a valley or something. In actual fact, although it's only 10 miles away from there, it's in a completely dead flat plain, and a totally different landscape. And had I not bothered to go and wander around, in actual fact, with the current Duke of Wellington, who wanted to see it, and I went along with it, I would never have. I'd have given a completely false impression of what that battle was like.
You've written much on colonial India. Now, did you find Hobson Jobson, or did Hobson Jobson find you?
I remember reading about Hobson Jobson, first of all, in a book of essays by Salman Rushdie.
Oh yes.
The very first wonderful book of Rushdie journalism, which came out in the sort of, I think, the 90s, and which is one of my most treasured books of book reviews and essays. Rushdie, I think, never quite equaled those early essays in his nonfiction. And he wrote a wonderful essay on Hobson Jobson and all the British words, which turn out to be derived from different Indian languages, whether Tamil or Telugu or Hindi. So I remember going into Bari San's in-car market in the late 80s, early 90s, and buying a copy of Hobson Jobson and getting it bound in leather and just browsing through it. It was a wonderful thing. And I bring it into City of Djinns.
Yes. You also brought it into anarchy. One of your footnotes, you had quoted from Sir William Foster's The English Factories in India, where he uses extraordinary words that make me blush. I can't use them in the podcast. But he did say that the English were reviled in the streets of Surat with words such as this B word and this B word, which my modest language will not address. Foster's book, volume 3, page 345.
Yes, words that one would have assumed are just used by Punjabi taxi drivers today to shout at people to get in their way, turn out to be of great antiquity and to be shouted at early Brits in India in the 17th century.
Sadly, I'll say it's also all the salespeople who work for me. It's not all Hobson Jobson that I refer to. It's also the fact that you had to deal with obscure English and old usage. For instance, you use the word factors in reference to what? Agents, representatives? How are they called factors?
Yeah, and the East India Company early settlements were called factories. Some of them were factories in the modern sense.
You mean like things that produce things?
Yeah, things that produce things, and but many of them were just what today would be called godowns. I think, storage places, or I suppose most like a hotel or a caravanserai. That they were, places that were residential, but also had eating quarters, and they were modelled very much on a Mughal caravanserai, the initial ones, and the people that lived in the factories were called factors.
Ah, okay. But I imagine you have to deal with these things all the time. So what happens? Do you have to go find the etymology? Really obscure words and phrases.
Well, I've been writing about the East India Company for 20 years now, so I kind of know the lingo, and I often forget. I often forget that other people don't. But if you're dealing with a very early company, you have something else to put your head around, which is called secretary hand. And it's English written in something that looks a bit like Cyrillic script. It's a completely different typeface. Not just typeface, completely different script. Some of the words are common with English, but it is something you have to learn. And the early letters of the factors from the factories in India, from the Surat factory to the East India Company headquarters, for the first 100 years are in secretary hand. And I found that I could, it would take me, well, certainly when I began, it would take me a whole morning to do a couple of sides of A4. One would move very slowly. Although it was English, the script was unfamiliar.
Do you mean it was a bit like Pittman's shorthand?
Yes, it's a bit like that. Exactly like that. Yeah. Elizabethan version of it.
Right. It's all very obscure to me. And let me tell you, I spent the better part of this morning hunting down the etymology of this, that, and the other. Another rabbit hole, William.
Well, plenty of those, in fact.
But I do enjoy adventure. Speaking of which, what's the Dalrymple holiday look like? Beach or mountains?
Or both. Very hard to choose between the two. Depending on the time of year, it would be. I mean, if it's Christmas, I got to go. If it's this time of year, I get the hell out of Delhi and go straight up to Chamba, somewhere gorgeous above Kangra.
And the Jaipur Literature Festival is headed to Soneva Fushi in the Maldives, isn't it? I recently interviewed Sanjoy Roy in a previous episode.
Sanjoy, I heard it and I listened to it.
And Sanjoy was saying that this event at Soneva Fushi is going to be one of your bespoke editions, a rather exclusive event. Tell me about it.
I think this is partly. So the JLF is a threesome. There is Trinity who run it. Sanjoy is the producer, and he does an astonishing job running the business side and the logistics and so on. But Sanjoy has, many ways of making the ends meet for Jaipur, and recently it has often taken the form of expeditions to all sorts of odd places. And Namrat and I get an email to suddenly find that we're off to Boulder, Colorado in September, or disappearing off the face of the earth to Belfast, or in August. We never quite know. Anyway, Maldives is a new one. I've never been. This is all Sanjoy's initiative, and I say he does a wonderful job keeping us afloat, and I'm very, very grateful to him. But you never quite know what's going to come next. Maldives definitely beats Belfast.
I'll wager. Looking forward to it, though?
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it.
Cool.
We both are.
And so must your authors, right?
I mean, one of the issues with literary festivals is, getting the great writers to come. And we'd be very lucky just because Jaipur just sounds so fantastic. Very few people turned down invitations to Jaipur right from the beginning when we were small and unheard of. People would accept because they like the idea of getting out of New York or London in January when it's miserable in London and freezing in New York. Ditto, with bells on with the Maldives. Who's going to turn down a trip to a fantastic atoll in the Maldives? And but I have to say, I mean, let's be clear, these are wonderful things and they keep us afloat, and we couldn't probably survive financially without them.
Well, Soneva Fushi in the Maldives or anywhere else, the JLF does arrive with a certain amount of pedigree, doesn't it?
We're very proud, the three of us, of what we've built. It is now the biggest literary festival in the world. It's one of the reasons I think that we've done so well as a threesome at Jaipur is that none of us could do the other's job. Sanjoy is a spectacular producer. Namata knows the Bhasha and the Indian literary scene like very few other people, and I've been lucky enough to have some pretty good contacts with the global literary community in the course of my book tours and so on, and can send out invitations to friends from all over, and they will come. And between the three of us, we've seen this thing grow from a very, very small experimental event in the Durbar Hall to this vast, sprawling thing that happens each January now.
And cycling back to William Dalrymple, a very wise man once ought to have said, dying is one of the worst things that you can do for your literary reputation. What is William Dalrymple going to do to keep living?
That's a very ominous question.
Oh, I'm kidding.
I think that's...
I was quoting you, as you know.
Yes, and I think that was about Bruce Chatwin. Chatwin didn't do his reputation any good by dying, because once you cease to produce books, the publicity engine of publishing companies look the other way, and your books sink or swim. I mean, sometimes you find books coming back into print.
How much the East India Company has taught us all.
Exactly, but no, I'm alive and well, and looking forward to continuing writing. I actually am about to give birth on Monday to begin work, putting actually pen to paper on my latest book, The Golden Road.
And the book is about?
The diffusion of Indian culture around Asia. Part one is the story of Buddhism going up to China. Part two is how Hinduism and Buddhism both went down to Southeast Asia. And part three is how Indian numbers and science and so on went to first to Baghdad and then through the Arab world, and were brought from what's now Algeria to Italy by Fibonacci. And the book ends in 12th century Sicily with Indian numbers finally becoming the replacement for Latin numbers in Europe.
That's an awful lot of research. How long does it take you to write a book?
I tend to operate on sort of 4-year cycles. And it's normally 3 years research, of which the first year will be combined with the book tour of the last book. So I will be reading and researching while, moving on planes from Adelaide to Sydney or from LA to San Francisco, wherever it is that I'm doing book readings. And then finally, in year 4, actually sit down and try and write it fairly quickly. I try and write a book in 6 months, but I try, and history books, fat though they are, usually take me 9 months to a year.
That's very disciplined. It means you must have some sort of schedule to your writing. Are you like Hemingway, early in the morning, write standing up?
I am not standing up, but early morning. And I think I have always been a great Hemingway fan, and I used to read those descriptions that he wrote of getting up early in the morning and putting on his shorts and going down to the typewriter. There's a wonderful description of it in his posthumous book, The Garden of Eden, which is a lot about the writing process, written ironically when he was finding writing much more difficult towards the end. And I mean, to be a writer is such a privilege and a gas, and it's such a delightful and exciting and thrilling and fulfilling way to make a living if you can make it work.
Right.
But there is always the but, which is actually the writing bit of it. The writing bit of it. The writing bit of it is no fun at all.
That little bit of detail.
That little bit of detail.
So I imagine this is an all-consuming, very disciplined period.
I stop drinking. I diet. I get up early. Much the worst bit of it is the first month, because once you've actually got a pile of stuff that's working, you can relax a little. And if you have 100 pages of good prose, you know that it's probably going to be okay.
And when may I anticipate you're signing a copy of the book for me?
Hopefully, it should be out in 18 months, if all goes well. But I'm very nervous about this one. But for the last 20 years, I've been doing colonial history in the 18th century, which has its own problems, but it's, I knew by the time I got to the Anarchy, I absolutely knew how to do it. I knew where the sources were. And I had this wonderful collaborator, Bruce Wannell, who's my wonderful friend, who's worked on the Persian translations. And he was also a sort of ustad in all sorts of ways. He died after the Anarchy was published. He had terrible pancreatic cancer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And so this current book is partly, in a sense, trying to find another world to occupy. Now that with Bruce gone, in many ways, the key to Narnia in that has been lost, in the sense that he was able to read any Urdu, any Persian source that you threw at him, and therefore had access to a lot of Indian history that no one else could read. And we went off together to weird little libraries in places like Tonk in Rajasthan, or Patna, or the National Archives, the vast stacks of the British Museum, and would find the stuff that no one ever harvested. And for 20 years, for the 4 books of the Company Quartet, The Anarchy, White Moguls, The Last Mogul, Turn the King, that's what we did.
Once again, I'm sorry for your loss. And now the quartet is available as a collection, isn't it?
Now, not in America, but in India and in Britain, there's a 4-volume box set with them in not the order I wrote it, but the chronological order, which is Anarchy, which starts in the time of Shakespeare and takes you through to the Duke of Wellington and the Marathas in 1803. White Moguls is set as a sort of micro-history in Hyderabad between 1798 and 1805, the romance between Kirkpatrick and Karenisa. Then there is Return of the King, which is the story of the East India Company's disastrous attempt to invade Afghanistan and the retreat from Kabul and the massacre of that army, largely Indian, which never made it to Jalalabad. And finally, Last Mughal, which is the story up to Bahadur Shah Zafar, where we opened this podcast, to bring it very nicely in a circular point to where we began.
Yes, indeed. That is true. We're back to the Last Mughal. Now, there's a link in the podcast description to where you might be able to buy the quartet. William, I know that you said that you lost the key to Narnia, and I know that this is not going to make up for it. But as the mayor, I'd like to offer you a key to the literary city. I just have to go look for it. As soon as I find it, I'll mail it to you.
Thank you very much.
William Dalrymple, thank you so much for your time and for being my guest.
A huge pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Fun with William Dalrymple, and I'll be back with What's That Word? And I'm back with What's That Word? And to help me with it is my co-host, and as always, I will let her introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Praniti, but you can call me P. That's P with an A, not another E.
Hello, P with an A and not another E. What did you do today?
Hey, that was such a lovely interview with William Dalrymple.
Oh, thanks.
Sounded like you were pretty well versed with his writing.
I am. I'm glad it showed. You know, I've had to reread some of his books just for this interview, of course.
What did you reread?
Well, I reread Lost Mountain, which I had thoroughly enjoyed the first time around. And I reread The Last Mughal and Anarchy. Well, I read Anarchy, not reread Anarchy. Hadn't read it before.
A lot of work.
A lot of fun, you know. And I read Paris' review of books also. And incidentally, the instruction manual for my home theater system.
Huh? Okay, cool. But what connection does that have with Dalrymple?
None whatsoever. You were curious about my reading, so I thought I'd let you know.
Oh, how literary.
Okay, P with an A, what's the word?
It's words, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Title, really, I want to discuss.
Oh, wait. Let me guess. You want to discuss Hobson Jobson, correct?
You're so right. Am I getting predictable?
Well, in fairness, if I were in your place, all I talk about is Hobson Jobson.
Cool. Thanks for saying so.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, go. Dish.
All right. Hobson Jobson. Hobson Jobson is a dictionary of Anglo-Indian words. By that, not the community of Anglo-Indians, but words during Anglo-India, during the East India Company and then the Raj. So it's a dictionary of Anglo-Indian words and terms from Indian languages, which came into use in English as a consequence of, before and during the British rule. Well, it was put together by Henry Yule and Arthur Burnell, two civil service dudes who clearly had a lot of time whilst administering the colonies. It's a compilation of words. Actually, what the best thing to do is, let me read you the book's subtitle. It leaves nothing to imagination.
Mm-hmm.
The subtitle is this: A Glossary of Colloquial Anglo-Indian Words and Phrases and of kindred terms, etymological, historical, geographical, and discursive.
Okay.
In Anglo-Indian English, the term Hobson Jobson referred to any festival or entertainment, but the one with the most currency as the etymology for the title is not a celebration, but a ceremony during the morning of Muharram. In its origin, the term is a corruption by British soldiers of Ya Hossan, Ya Hossein, which is repeatedly chanted by the Shia Muslim people throughout the procession of the Muharram. And the British soldiers corrupted that chant to Hossein, Gossein, and then Hossi, Gossi, and then Hussein, Josein, and finally it became Hobson Jobson, and that's the origin. That thing, Hobson Jobson, that's also called echo words or rhyming reduplications like Humpty Dumpty, Mumbo Jumbo, Hokey Pokey.
Namby Pamby.
Yes, you called.
That's so self-deprecating.
They thought that their title was a hoot, a typical and delightful example, they said, implying their own dual authorship. Brings a tear to the eye.
Hey, do you have a copy?
Of course I do. Over the years, I've owned several copies, always given them away, and always gone running for yet another copy. The one I have now has about 1,000 pages.
We threw that many words into English?
At least, and we continue to. But many, no, I'll say most, are not in use anymore.
What are some of the words? Wait, I know shampoo and khichdi.
And surprisingly, these words: loot, barbicans, tank, muddle, and dam, and many more.
A few from your interview now. You asked Dalrymple about the word factory.
Yes, I did. That word is in Hobson Jobson under F.
Hey, wait. I'm not letting you escape.
Oh no.
What was that curse word you guys were laughing about? The one that made you blush?
It made me blush then. I couldn't say it, and I'm not going to say it now.
Okay, wait, I have an idea.
Mhm.
Let's do a wordle.
Well, Wordle doesn't have enough letters for it, thankfully.
Okay, I'm going to guess. It starts with a B.
Yes.
Delhi taxi drivers use it.
All the time.
Okay, I got it. Oh my. And that word is in Hobson Jobson?
Yes, under B, How polite we are.
Yeah, more polite than Hobson and Jobson, really.
Hobson and Jobson, the terrible twins.
Yeah. And what was that Salman Rushdie reference? He wrote about Hobson Jobson?
Yeah.
Hey, neither of you mentioned the name of Rushdie's book.
Oh, sorry. Well, it's an essay on Hobson Jobson from Rushdie's Imaginary Homelands. For many, that essay was their very introduction to Hobson Jobson.
Yeah, that's what Dalrymple said too.
Anyway, that book, or rather that essay, is where I found that dam is a Hobson Jobson word.
Dam, like the thing that holds river water?
No, dam, no, not like the Tungabhadra. This is dam. Dam, like the expression. Actually, let me read you Rushdie's closing line from his essay where he references Gone with the Wind, the very final scene. And I quote, as Rhett Butler once said to Scarlett O'Hara, frankly, my dear, I don't give a small copper coin weighing 1 tola, 8 mashas, and 7 surks, being the 40th part of a rupee, or, to put it more precisely, a dam. It's funny.
That's funny. Okay, I have a rhyming duplication of my own.
You do? Cool, let's hear it.
It goes, bye-bye.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening, and see you again next Wednesday.